Hi, thanks for watching. This video is going to be about congruent supplements and congruent complements, and what kind of conclusions can we draw if two angles are supplementary to the same angle or complementary to the same angle, and what kind of conclusions can we draw if angles are supplementary to congruent angles or complementary to congruent angles. So all in all, we're going to study 4 theorems tonight. So you really need to make sure that you're beginning to build up a set of flashcards, either made on index cards or through an app that you found that you like. Because in the next few videos, the number of theorems is really going to expand. Okay, I hope you enjoy watching this, and I hope it helps. Suppose we were given some information that all we knew was that angle B, this angle here, was supplementary to angle N. We also knew that angle Y was supplementary to angle N. What conclusion could you draw? And then we'll explore what the reason is for it. Well, you might notice, just from looking at it, that as I manipulate the size of angle B, it stays supplementary to angle N. But what's the relationship going on between angle B and angle Y? Okay, let's take a look at the conclusion. If you haven't come up with one yet, hit pause until you do. Alright, the proper conclusion is that angle B and angle Y are congruent. And the reason is the first theorem tonight. If angles are supplementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. Let's make sure you have a picture that looks like this one, with this given information on it, on the front, and then on the back, this conclusion and this reason. The proof of this is pretty easy. Let's take a look at the angle measurements. Here we see, actually, there we go. You can see that angle B and angle N are indeed supplementary. That takes care of our first given. And you can see that angle Y and angle N are supplementary. That takes care of the second given. Well, no matter how we manipulate the measure of these angles, angle ABC and angle XYZ remain congruent because they both have to be the measure that will be supplementary to angle N. Okay, let's take a look at a more complicated diagram, but really a very similar theorem. Suppose we're told that angle B is supplementary to angle N, just as the picture kind of implies they are. And angle Y is supplementary to angle S. No surprise there either. And finally, suppose that we're given one angle of each pair of supplementary angles that are congruent. So in this case, angle N is congruent to angle S. What conclusion can you draw? Take a minute, hit the pause button, and see if you can come up with a conclusion. And maybe, in your own words, see if you can figure out why your conclusion is true. Okay, hit the pause button now. Okay, did you get it? Alright, let's take a look at the conclusion. If we know this given information, we can conclude that angle B is congruent to angle Y. And the reason is our next theorem. If angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. Alright, let's take a look at what this is saying. If two angles, like B and Y, are supplementary to two congruent angles, and those two congruent angles are N and S. So when you see them showing up here, and their supplementary is showing up twice, you can be sure that the other two angles, B and Y, must be congruent too. Alright, let's quickly take a look at a more formal proof of that. Once again, I'm going to lay out all the steps. We're told that in step 1, angle B is sup to angle N. We know that because it's given. So, if that's true, then angle B plus angle N must equal 180. Because from the definition we know if two angles are supplementary, then their sum is 180. Now the next reason is one you don't know. In step number 3, we move n to the other side of the equation, and the reason we can do that is just by algebra. Alright, step 4 is very similar to step 1. It gets back to the given information that y is sup to angle S. In step 5, very similar to step 2, but here we're using two different angles. Angle y plus angle S equals 180, because if two angles are sup, then their sum is 180. We make a similar change to the equation as we did in step 3, and the justification is by algebra. In step 7, we use our last given, that angle N and angle S are congruent. That lets us set up a substitution, where I'm substituting angle N in step 7 into the equation for S in step 6. Therefore, since both B and angle Y are equal to 180 minus N, as shown in step 8 and step 3, the two angles have to be congruent, because if two angles have the same measure, then they are congruent. Alright, let's take a look at a couple of theorems involving complementary angles before we finish up the video. Let's take a look at a situation where the angles are complementary. In this diagram, the angle on top, DAE, is complementary to EAB, and the angle below, FAB, is also complementary to the angle in the middle, EAB. So what conclusion and what reason could you come up with given that information? Take a minute, hit the pause button, and see if you can come up with a conclusion on your own. Alright, given this information, we can conclude that the angle on top, DAE, is congruent to the angle on the bottom, FAB, and the reason will be our next theorem. If two angles are complementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. Let's take a look at the proof of why this is true. In step 1, we take care of the first given, and then in step 2, we use the definition of complementary to justify that the two angles' sum is equal to 90. In step 3, I'm going to manipulate the equation from 2 by moving angle EAB over to the right side by algebra. Step 4 is the given information again. Step 5 just uses the definition of complementary to justify why the sum of the FAB and EAB is 90. We're going to make a similar manipulation of the equation in step 6 as we did in step 3. So now that you notice, in step 3, angle DAE equals 90 minus angle EAB. In step 6, FAB equals the same thing. So we can conclude in step 7 that angle DAE is congruent to FAB because if two angles are the same measure, then they are congruent, which is our new theorem. If two angles are complementary to the same angle, then they are congruent, just as our chain of reasoning would have set up for us. Okay, so make sure you make an index card for that, and we'll move on to the last theorem for this video. The last theorem for this video involves four angles, similar to when we looked at four angles that were supplementary. Here, the given information tells us that angle 1 is complementary to angle 2, angle 3 is complementary to angle 4, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. What conclusion can you draw, and why do you think it's true? Take a minute, hit the pause button, and see if you can come up with a conclusion on your own. Okay, hopefully you came up with the conclusion that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. And the reason is our final theorem. If two angles are complementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. The proof is very similar to the proof that if two angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. So if you want to go back in the video and take a look at that, the steps are very similar. Okay, there's a lot of theorems tonight. I hope you take the time to make some index cards or put together some flashcards in an app. Draw out the pictures and the given information on one side and the conclusion and the reason on the other. That was a lot of theorems. Hopefully, you're taking the time to make the note cards or make the flashcards on the app, because we're going to get 6 more theorems in the next video, and I think 2 more after that, and then 3 more after that. So once we get through chapter 2, we'll have collected a lot of theorems, and unless you're keeping them straight and organized, it's really going to get tough. So please take the time to do that. Other than that, thanks for watching. I hope this helped, and see you tomorrow in class.